Welcome again to another IB History Quick Hit. We are going to be talking today about Japanese expansion in East Asia, but we're going to go back to the 19th century and begin this story there. This is all about the rise of Japanese nationalism and militarism, and I want you to keep in mind 4 points that lead to this origin of Japanese militarism and nationalism. First, Japan's desire to turn into a Western-style military power. Second, Japan's belief that they should dominate the Asian sphere over their Asian counterparts. Third, the necessity to acquire raw materials and new markets in East Asia. Japan wants to be an imperial power. And finally, fourth, Japan's discrimination at the hands of Western powers. But to begin this talk, we're going to go back in time a little bit to 1853 with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry. This is an American naval officer who arrives with an American fleet in Tokyo Harbor, and they open Japan's eyes to the reality that they need to adapt, they need to modernize, or else they're going to be treated the same way that China has been treated at the hands of the British, for example, in the Opium War. Japan signs unequal treaties with the United States, and this leads to some frustration from the upper echelon of the Japanese government. By 1868, that frustration boils over into a revolution called the Meiji Restoration, where the emperor will rise to preeminence once again in the Japanese government. And this Meiji Restoration is important because it signals a push to Japan, rather than remaining an isolated East Asian state, to move to being a modernized, westernized, industrialized power. So the Meiji Restoration signals some dramatic changes in Japanese society, in Japanese education, in the Japanese military, and Japanese politics. The Japanese government is going to develop a new constitution, a written rule of law. Japanese cities and cultures will start to be reshaped on a Western model, and you can see in this image here, you have some Japanese wearing the traditional clothes of Japan, but then we see some in suits and coats like Westerners. The education system will be reformed, and the Japanese will adopt a Western-style education, German-style education, German-style schooling, but with a focus on some ideals like patriotism, duty to one's country, reverence for the Emperor of Japan, and the Japanese military is going to be remade. The Navy will be created with a model on the British Navy. The Japanese military will be reshaped and built in the shadows of the German military. We can see these Japanese officers in Western-style military clothes. And so by the time we get to the 1890s, Japan has done a fair amount of industrialization. They've modernized their military, and now they're going to put that military to work. There are three main wars that the Japanese army is going to take part in, that will begin to expand the Japanese empire. First, in 1894, the Sino-Japanese War, Japan versus China. Japan is going to win this war. China is severely overmatched compared to the new Japanese army and navy. So Japan wins the Sino-Japanese War. They will be granted Taiwan from China, and they will push for Korean quote-unquote independence. 10 years later, in 1904, we have a war called the Russo-Japanese War, pitting Japan versus now a European power in Russia. Both Russia and Japan were kind of eyeing the region of Manchuria to the north of Korea and the northern part of China, and their competing interests there ultimately would lead to conflict. The fighting obviously takes place in East Asia, which is a severe disadvantage for the Russians, whose Atlantic fleet is literally on the other side of the world, and Japan will ultimately defeat the Russians. With the treaty that comes out after the Russo-Japanese War, it's called the Treaty of Portsmouth, actually negotiated by American President Teddy Roosevelt. The Japanese will gain some territorial concessions. First, they're going to gain what's called the South Sakhalin Island. Here's Sakhalin Island, and they get the southern part of that from Russia. Also, the Japanese control of Korea will be recognized by the Russian state. That Korean peninsula will ultimately be annexed by Japan, by the Japanese Empire, in 1910. Japan will also gain a sphere of influence over the region of Manchuria. Japan is now, with the defeat of a European power, Japan is now seen as a rising world power. During the First World War, Japan will decide to join the Allied powers, the Entente powers, and they will target some German holdings in Asia. With the victory in the First World War, Japan will send an emissary, or send a group to the Paris Peace Conference to advocate for Japanese interests in the Paris Peace Conference, and they do get some Pacific holdings that Germany had held, the Pacific Empire of Germany. But Japan fails to be respected when it comes to the acceptance of a racial equality clause that Japan wanted worked into the Treaty of Versailles. Japan wanted all nations of the world to be treated equally, regardless of their race or ethnicity, and the United States and Britain and Australia, they just weren't hearing this because of our own empires and racial issues that we have within our own countries. But we now see Japan as a world power, but for many Japanese, they still feel they're not being treated as equal world powers, and they're right. After World War II, we go through the 1920s, and we see Japan entering a period of internationalism. Rather than just pushing for exclusively Japanese interests, the decade of the 1920s starts to move the world from one of just fervent nationalism to, we don't want another war like that again. We don't want another World War I. So maybe we can start working with the international community a little bit more. And much of that is led by this man, Shidehara Kajuro, who is a Japanese foreign minister, and he was originally ambassador to the United States, eventually be a prime minister in Japan, and he moves Japan to being this internationalist state. And much of this comes from, one, Japanese membership in the League of Nations. Japan is going to be one of the founding members of the League of Nations. But two, Japanese involvement in a international meeting known as the Washington Conference in 1921 and 22. Out of this Washington Conference comes a number of agreements. First, the Four-Power Treaty, where Japan and the United States and Britain and France will agree to talk with each other if any of their Asian holdings are threatened. Second, the Nine-Power Treaty, where those same four countries and then some other European countries like Belgium and Italy and the Netherlands, basically everybody that had interest in China and China itself in this Nine-Power Treaty, agree to respect Chinese independence and sovereignty. But you can imagine how that's going to turn out. And then finally, the Five-Power Naval Treaty. And this is the one that maybe is most frustrating for some Japanese, especially the Japanese military, where the United States and Britain and France and Italy and Japan would agree to naval limits, agree to a ratioed base navy. So the United States and Britain, they would get the largest navies in the world, then France, and then Italy and Japan. There would be this ratio based on tonnage of military ships. So for every 5 that the United States would get, Britain would get 5. So they're equal. France would get 3, and then Italy and Japan would get 1.75. And this was deeply maddening to many Japanese, the Japanese Navy, the Japanese military, many conservatives in Japan, because Japan as an island nation needs a navy. Japan's got a Pacific Ocean to tangle with, whereas they're getting the same navy or allowed the same navy as a country like Italy on the Mediterranean Sea. This was seen as just more discrimination against the Japanese. But they're still playing this internationalist game. There are problems on the horizon, though. The Japanese democratic government had some problems. There was some weakness. There was financial scandals that were plaguing the government. There were deep concerns of left-wing movements and communist movements. The Red Scare that the United States dealt with in the late 19 teens and early 20s, Japan is going through the exact same thing. And then conservatives in Japan, particularly conservatives in the military, are deeply questioning this move towards internationalism. There's a lot of frustration because by 1924, the United States passes the Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially bans Japanese immigration to the United States. And so like Japan is thinking, why are we working with these nations that are openly racist and discriminatory towards us? And then in the post-war years, there's going to be an economic crisis as the war boom came to an end. Unemployment starts to rise, labor protests and unrest begin to rise, and this will only be exacerbated by the Great Depression in 1929. We also need to mention at the same time that Japan is going through these frustrations and they're having some pushback from their conservatives, we've got China across the East China Sea, we've got China that is dealing with their own political crisis, the beginnings of a Chinese civil war, a conflict between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, and this Chinese political instability is giving Japan the understanding that they could have further expansions into Asia, particularly Manchuria. So there you go. Pretty quick and easy, and we'll see you next time.